And welcome everybody to the live webinar 9/11, an Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, March, oh my gosh, 19th already. A three-part series today. And I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. Last week, we presented part 2, the Twin Towers explosive destruction. This is part 3, the Twin Towers and extreme heat, in which we'll be looking at the evidence of very high temperature incendiaries and chemical reactions involved in the destruction of these two skyscrapers. First, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hello, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. And just to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which do occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the course. Best way to do it is to submit them in the questions and information form online at AE 911 Truth. You get there by going to ae911truth.org, and you just go to continuing education and click the live webinars. You'll find it. I'll also be scouring our YouTube broadcast of this and Facebook broadcast of this for good comments, questions related to the material that Richard will be covering. So you can try to submit things there as well. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
And thanks, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums and the construction administration for this $125 million high school in the San Francisco Bay Area here. And let's see, there we go. And more recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $400 million mixed-use project near Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure. Altogether, about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. I now work full-time, though, educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses, which is why we now have 3,000 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these towers. We'll come back to that later. And but first, let me tell you how we're going to approach our problem today with the scientific method. We've had it in the West for 100 years or so. It's how we winnow error from truth, fact from fiction. And we formulate a question, right? How did those towers come down? We do background research. Okay, make observations. We come up with our best guess, really. That's a hypothesis. How we think the towers came down based on that research and those observations. Maybe the jet planes brought them down. Maybe it was the ensuing fires or explosions, which were heard as well. All of the hypotheses are laid out without specific power given to one or another of them due to our financial or political obligations that we might have. We test those hypotheses with experiments, analyze the results, draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner, unlike NIST did, as you'll see. And if the hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back and we construct a new one. That's what we're doing today. And we come up with a hypothesis that is corroborated, that does stand up against the evidence and the experiments, the research, and so forth. So let's start out with some background research. How have buildings been destroyed, high-rises? Well, not by fires before 9/11, but say in a wood frame building, fire is an organic process, so it'll bring a building down in, it'll fall over to the path of least resistance after burning an area out in about 20 minutes. That's all the fuel there is in modern high-rises. For instance, 20 or 30 minutes, even as acknowledged by NIST. So, but say in wood frame buildings, they would fall over to the path of least resistance. And we would look for the building to fall in stages as well, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance, the tons of structure beneath the fire, say in the cold hard steel in a modern high rise. Well, there's been tests in modern high rises. British Steel in Cardington, the UK, did the largest test of its kind ever, 8 stories. Some of these beams were fireproofed in the steel frame building. Some of them were not. Incredible quantities of fuel were created because they wanted to find the worst case scenario here. What would happen in that scenario? So as you can see on the left, all of that fuel. And as you can also see, some of these beams were not fireproofed. The connections not fireproofed. Some of them were. So we have a very good wide spectrum of testing that was done. Let's see what happened.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
Until recently, of course, he's referring to 9/11 when we had not one, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire. The conclusion of this study, it's inherently stable due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. Well, how about other high rises, in this case mid-rises, that have fallen due to natural causes? Here we have earthquakes that have caused these collapses. But you can see the building in somewhat intact. Its columns and beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. The building is certainly mangled, but recognizable as a building in the aftermath. So we'll be comparing that to what happened at the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Now, these buildings were blown up. We have thick, billowing, enormous pyroclastic-like clouds of smoke that are rapidly expanding in cauliflower-shaped plumes with a solid edge. All this due to the incredibly hot gases from the ignition of the explosives. So we have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, this phenomena, these witnesses, we know we have explosions. We'll be looking for this kind of evidence today, as we did last week in part 2 of this 3-part series, which is available, by the way, if you missed part 2 and part 1 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide, be sure to look for it on YouTube. Just search part 2, 9/11 An Architect's Guide. So let's see how explosions can be harnessed quite effectively to bring down very tall buildings like this one and these. We have explosives loaders that place shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building after having been very carefully engineered by structural engineers to facilitate the destruction piece by piece in these buildings. And so we have a set of features that are associated with these buildings, which, by the way, can only be created, engineered by a small handful of companies in the United States. Fire doesn't do this to buildings. Let's look at those features. We have a sudden onset of destruction near the base of the structure, a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint, patterned removal of column supports. That's how we achieve that, resulting in a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what was the greatest resistance, thousands of tons of structural steel in the building, and also resulting in the total dismemberment of that structural steel frame with limited damage to adjacent structures. Feature number 7, patterned explosions heard by witnesses, flashes of light seen by them. We looked at this last week in part 2 of this series. Broken up concrete floors. We also looked at that. Pulverized concrete last week. And explosive charges visible in many of the floors, and chemical evidence left behind, of course, which we'll be looking at today. But all of that is typical features of controlled demolition. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. In fact, there's been a series of case studies, 100 fires in high-rise buildings that have never brought down one of them before 9/11. Let's take a look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
So no collapses in high-rise buildings, not even this one. World Trade Center 5, right near, fully engulfed. If any of these buildings at the World Trade Center were to collapse, we'd expect it to be this one. But no collapse. Why? Well, we have the steel, incredible quantities of steel, very dense material conducting that heat away from the source of the fire. So it never gets to its 1200 degree Fahrenheit temperature where steel can begin to weaken and begins to melt. It doesn't melt. It bends. It melts at about 2800 degrees Fahrenheit. But to keep any of that from happening, we put fireproofing on it. 2 hours on the beams and 3 hours on the columns. And that's more than 6 times the time that a fire can burn in any given area, which is in an office building. There's only enough fuel to burn 20 or 30 minutes as acknowledged by NIST. Also, we keep the buildings from being built out of combustible materials and regulate very highly what the tenants can bring in to those buildings in terms of fuel loads. And to keep all that from becoming a problem, though, we have fire extinguishing systems, sprinklers, which are put in these buildings. And those were, in the case of the Twin Towers, damaged by the planes, according to the official story. So with additional circumstantial corroborative evidence, such as government documentation, this can be very helpful. You don't just bring down a controlled a high-rise in a controlled demolition without approvals. Typically, I mean, foreknowledge. So that's what we have in advance, people who know about the buildings. We looked at plenty of that last week, and experts agreeing, hey, yeah, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion. With video documentation, all this can be proof of controlled demolition. Proof which we're going to apply now to the Twin Towers, looking at these feature by feature. First, is there a sudden onset of destruction? Well, we looked at this along with each of these key features last week in 1 through 7 with part 2. So I encourage you again to dig that out of YouTube and take a look at it. Patterned explosions and flashes of light we saw, straight down symmetrical progression outside the building's footprint. We found that if 100,000 tons of structural steel was delivered outside each of these buildings, and 90,000 tons of structural concrete was delivered outside of each of these buildings in that layer 4-inch thick through lower Manhattan, then that's 2/3 the weight of the building. There's really hardly anything left to crush the building. That's extremely important material there. Ejections of materials at 80 miles an hour out of the building, explosives, squibs, isolated explosive ejections. We looked at the free fall acceleration or near free fall, straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, and the total shattering of the structural steel frame, which the NFPA 921 Guide for Fire and Explosion Investigation calls evidence of high order damage. And blast pressure wave effects ejecting lateral expulsion of 4 and 8 ton units up to 600 feet away at 60 to 80 miles an hour. And pyroclastic-like clouds of pulverized concrete we talked about. All this was direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Today we're going to advance to feature 8, 9, and 10, starting with pyroclastic-like clouds, because the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 is the guide used in this country and around the world substantially for fire and explosion investigation. It says, look for thermal effects. Do we have that? Look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, that's exactly what we have issuing rapidly out of the Twin Towers, and all the photos and videos. In fact, 10 times the volume of the building in just 30 seconds. An incredible amount of heat requiring this rapidly unfolding cauliflower-shaped plumes that are engulfing the rest of Manhattan very rapidly, requiring a whole lot more heat than what we have in the Twin Towers, which even at the time of the collapse were diminished and oxygen starved, indicated by the thick black smoke. So we're talking about a whole lot more heat than this. These fires were probably extinguished by the time the collapse was halfway down. So where did that heat come from? That's what we're looking at today. A whole lot more heat, something on the order of this. So let's take a look and see what the evidence is here, starting with Massimo Mazzucco's 9/11.
Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
We had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still I believe 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later.
And as we get closer, to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was a core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. It was just a bright reddish orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
The grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
We would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60 foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Worksite, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's when the fire is going to start burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished.
Well, let's look at some of these witnesses, including David Scott of Arup Associates. Well, let's look at some of these witnesses. Red hot steel being pulled from deep within the pile several weeks after the collapse. Dripping from the molten steel, says this firefighter. Pools of literally molten steel, the World Trade Center, says the president of the cleanup company. Seeing the molten steel, uncovering red-hot metal beams, ranging from molten metal, which was still red-hot weeks after the event, molten steel at the heart of the tower's remains, streams of molten metal that leaked down the hot cores and flowed down. Why are we looking at all of these witnesses of this molten metal, molten steel? Because fires don't create, office fires and jet fuel don't create these kinds of temperatures, as we'll show you. Metal dripping from a beam, molten steel beams. The end of the beam would be dripping with molten steel. Mark Loiseau, president of one of the cleanup companies, in this case, Controlled Demolition, Inc. Interestingly enough, molten steel was encountered primarily during excavation of debris. There are both videotape and still photos of the molten steel being dipped out by the buckets of the excavators. A little river of molten steel, or steel flowing, says who? The structural engineer of the World Trade Center himself, Leslie Robertson, and his associate, Richard Garlock, who says the debris past the columns was red hot, molten, running. As you see, pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse. Upon being asked about this very frequently, NIST said in their frequently asked questions published years later that it must be molten aluminum. Well, molten aluminum doesn't glow yellow in white hot, in red, in daylight conditions, as you see in this material pouring out of the crab claw excavator. How about the architect? Oh, Bart Vorsanger.
One of the more unusual artifacts to emerge from the rubble is this rock-like object that has come to be known as the meteorite.
It's this fused element of steel, molten steel and concrete and all of these things all fused by the heat.
Well, I didn't even know concrete could melt, but here it is in the Police Museum in New York. It melts at 3,200 degrees Fahrenheit. What got that hot? Fire temperature is so intense that concrete melted like lava around everything in its path. And steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures, says the author of the FEMA report, Dr. Jonathan Barnett. But we have a problem here. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel, 3,000 degrees to melt concrete, 2,800 degrees to begin to melt steel. And yet here it is, documented by Abolhassan Astani Azal, the Berkeley professor who had a National Science Foundation grant to study the steel, but he doesn't know how it melted. He says, if you remember the Salvador Dali paintings with the clocks that are kind of melted, it's like that. It could only happen if you get steel yellow hot or white hot, perhaps around 2,000 degrees. Massive columns here. Take a look.
Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapse are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at ground zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts.
Hey, we're getting somewhere because FEMA, the first U.S. agency to do a building failure report in May of 2002, documented in Appendix C of their Building Performance Assessment Report and Metallurgical Examination, in which they find that the steel, a 1-inch thick column, has been reduced to 1/2-inch thickness, its edges curled like a paper scroll, having been thinned to almost razor sharpness. Jet fuel can't possibly do this, as you'll see. So what is going on here? Mysterious sulfidation documented by the New York Times says rapid oxidation, sulfidation, intergranular melting. Liquid molten iron. This is not the New York Times, but this is the original report done by Sisson. But interestingly enough, the hot sulfur attack on the steel. And there's no clear explanation for the source of the sulfur, they say. Well, the New York Times says this is perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation. Yet it's completely ignored by NIST, omitted in the final report when they took over in 2002 from FEMA, who had documented the presence of sulfur invading the grain boundaries of the steel. How does that even happen? in a fire. NIST being asked very frequently, again, finally, years later, published. The sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard that was prevalent in the interior partitions. But wait a minute, gypsum board contains inert calcium sulfate, not sulfur. Its 100-year history of protecting steel structures, it's never turned around and attacked the steel that it's designed to protect. So experimentation is how you figure this out. Build a 2,000-degree fire if you can. Put gypsum against the steel. Does it attack the steel? No, it's clean as a whistle. So these made-up explanations by NIST are designed for another purpose, and that's to continue a cover-up, which we are uncovering as we speak. The smell of sulfur permeated the World Trade Center. Where is it all coming from? It burned, that smell of sulfur. Well, how about, what does NIST say about all this evidence of pools of molten iron and so forth? Let's listen to John Gross, the co-project leader.
First of all, let's go back to your basic premise that there was a pool of molten steel. I know of absolutely nobody, no eyewitness who said so, nobody who's produced it.
But witnesses testify otherwise.
You'd get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like it was lava from a volcano.
Actually melted beams where it was molten steel that was being dug out.
Underground, it was still so hot that molten metal dripped down the sides of the wall.
And the cleanup was very difficult in the beginning. Steel was coming out red in certain areas from the first couple of weeks.
This fused element of steel, molten steel.
And they pulled off a big block of concrete, and there was like a little river of steel flowing.
A river of steel flowing. And yet here's John Gross, the very individual saying there's no evidence of this, cutting off the very piece of the steel that was sent to FEMA for their metallurgical examination, in which they found the evaporation of steel and the liquid molten iron and sulfur attack on it. His shadow is all over the evidence. So the official story says maybe 1,200 degrees, according to Thomas Iger. NIST claims up to 1,800 degrees for the temperatures of these fires. But guess what? Hydrocarbons, meaning desks, and chairs, and paper, and jet fuel. By the way, jet fuel only burns 600 degrees in open air, according to their own major manufacturer, ME Petroleum. So what melted all this steel? As you can see, it's certainly melted, and we can tell its temperature by its color. That's the physics of molten metals. And up to 2,500 degrees here and higher, as it appears to be white hot down there below her. So, so more than twice the temperatures that hydrocarbons can even burn. What's causing it to melt? NIST says, after being very frequently asked years later in their FAQ section, any molten steel in the wreckage was more likely due to the high temperature resulting from long exposure to combustion within the pile than to short exposure to fires or explosions while the buildings were standing. Is that true? Because there's a law, you know, conservation of energy in a closed system, such as fires burning under pulverized concrete powder in the basements of the World Trade Center. The amount of energy is fixed. You can't create any more energy inside the system. In other words, the fire can't somehow get hotter than the capacity of the fuel that is burning. You can only convert that energy from one form to another. So the heat is dissipated. It's not increased. So another feeble attempt of explaining away fundamental truths revealed by the evidence you're looking at today. So let's go to feature number 10 and look for evidence of what might be producing these kinds of temperatures. What could be capable? Could thermite have produced that molten metal? And what is thermite anyway?
An incendiary used by the military
Thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Well, maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, then that would explain the presence of elemental iron. This molten material is iron, as you'll see later today. That's what's issued when thermite burns. 4,000 degree molten iron. That explains the incredible heat as well, not explained by jet fuel or office fires. Also explains the presence of sulfur. Sulfur is added to thermite, as you heard, to become thermate, much more effective at cutting through steel. But is there evidence of thermite found in the debris? That's the question I was asking. So we go to the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921, which says in its explosion investigation guide, the universal guide, by the way, here in the United States and around the world, largely, unusual residues. Look for them that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. NIST found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used when asked very frequently, which they published years later in their FAQ. This did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. And others did. In fact, Stephen Jones is one of them. Nuclear physicist formerly from Brigham Young University. He says, well, thermitic reactions would produce a characteristic burn pattern, a white, yellow, hot liquid metal, which we see pouring out of the South Tower minutes prior to its collapse, for instance. And a characteristic burn pattern, a whitish cloud of aluminum oxide ash, like we see rising off the liquid molten iron. And like we see trailing these thick white smoke clouds, trailing these 4 and 8 ton structural steel units that are freely flying back to, forward to. Structural steel is not flammable, so it's not on fire from the office fires or the jet fuel. So what's it on fire from? Trailing all these freely flying structural steel sections, not too indifferent than the volcanic eruption in the Tongan Sea, where molten rocks are distributed. It's a geometry of fireworks. Take a look. In each of these fairly identical collapses, we have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of freely flying structural steel sections. Didn't know steel could be on fire, but this is what
the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames.
So, what is that thermite? Well, thermite, Stephen Jones says, would leave behind a unique chemical evidence depending on the type of thermite. Common elements such as iron, aluminum, copper, calcium, silicon, but more unusual elements like fluorine and manganese left behind in the residue, which you never expect in office fires. These are elements in the periodic table of the elements. Well, he sent a piece of this 40-pound chunk of previously molten metal from one of these meteorites from the South Tower. And Stephen Jones does an electron microprobe data, finds that it's predominantly iron. So he rules out aluminum from the jet planes, as NIST was trying to explain. And he finds abundant manganese, so he can rule out structural steel as a major component. Because steel certainly has iron in it, but not abundant manganese, nor aluminum. So it has aluminum, sulfur, potassium. How did that get it? So he determines that this is the residue of thermite in this analysis of this one piece. It has manganese and fluorine in abundance. That's the key giveaway here. The manganese is from the potassium permanganate, commonly used as an oxidizer in thermite. Fluorine is used in sol gel type thermite charges. So these are often present in the residue and are part of a thermite fingerprint. It's very clear. But he notes sol gels, which is a very special type of super thermite. 1,3-diphenyl propane would be left behind. But was that left behind? Well, the EPA analysis of the dust finds one molecule at present at levels that dwarfed all others. I wonder which one it was. 1,3-diphenyl propane. We've never observed it in any other sampling we've ever done. Speculates it might be from computers, but they've never had a sampling from any of the office fires, which of course all have computers. So he sent another sample, the slag from the end of a beam from that sculpture in Canada. He does X-ray fluorescence analysis showing what? Iron, sulfur, potassium, manganese, carbon. What? Again, the key ingredients of a thermite fingerprint. Is that aluminum too? Yep, aluminum also. Well, you can do cut steel with your own homemade shaped cutter charges like John Cole did in Florida. This civil engineer created this.
Web was reduced in thickness with gaping holes, thinned to almost razor sharpness, with a Swiss cheese appearance.
Wait, where did we see that again? Oh, in the FEMA report, Appendix C, thinned to almost razor sharpness. So he was able to duplicate the experiment that shows how this World Trade Center steel attack with hot sulfur corrosion could have been done. There are more efficient ways to do it than in your backyard, though. Very expensive devices are designed for thermite, which issue molten iron streams in hundreds of milliseconds. So very effective, much more effective at cutting through thickened steel. Like we have 4-inch thick steel slabs at the World Trade Center that had to be cut through. So what are we looking at? We're looking at the possibility that this could have been done with this type. Now, why wouldn't they have used high energy explosives like C4 and RDX? RDX being more commonly used in controlled demolitions. Well, those provide an extremely loud bang and a bright flash. And of course, in a deceptive controlled demolition, which this obviously was, as we've gone through this series and are still going through it today, you wouldn't want those signatures. So apparently they, whoever they are, opted for something less pronounced, including perhaps one of these devices, not these devices, but the consolidated thermite container, the casing for this particular igniter device is burned up. All that's left is molten iron. So that could be done in a shaped cutter charge. But what else was found in the fine powder through Lower Manhattan spread in a 4-inch blanket, 3 square miles? The Particle Atlas of World Trade Center dust produced by the U.S. Geological Survey finds billions of previously molten iron microspheres. What are these? They're naked to the human eye almost. You can see them, but some of them are 1/16 of an inch large. They're previously molten. They're elemental iron, not steel. So we haven't used elemental iron in skyscrapers for about 100 years. Up to 6% of some of these samples are composed of what? Previously molten iron microspheres. It amounts to about up to 4 tons. Compare that to common office building dust, which has iron particles, but they're not round like you see on the right. They are all odd shapes, as you see on the left. And they're also found by the R.J. Lee Group, environmental concern, who says, I don't know where these came from, but they're formed during the event. They can, because of the round surface, as you see. That indicates a process formed during the event. And these are distinguished from common office building dust. The WTC dust is distinguished by these spheres, which they have no idea what the origin is, which comprise up to 6% of some of the dust samples. Well, how are they created? Well, here's one way that thermite works in a controlled experiment. Slowing it down, you have thousands of what look like sparks, but they're iron microspheres. They cool and they fall, as you see in all the dust around the World Trade Center on the tops of these cars. Could this be what explains the toasting of the tops of these cars? Is there any other rational explanation for the toasting in this incredible high heat event known as the World Trade Center? Cooling, falling, liquid molten iron droplets. Well, what else was found in the World Trade Center dust? Interestingly enough, a team of 8 scientists led by Niels Harrit in Copenhagen finds in samples like that are given to him independently, collecting 7 samples, like the one from Liberty Street across the street from the South Tower. Jeanette McKinley's apartment blew in, all the windows did, with incredible explosive force that we looked at last week in this 3-part series. She was an artist. She collected this dust, used it in her artwork, paid for that with her life, unfortunately, succumbing to brain cancer. But one of these samples are from hers, and they were documented in a 25-page peer-reviewed paper because they were real curious. The chips are attracted by a magnet, these small red-gray chips, red on one side, gray on the other. So the paint is not attracted by a magnet. So we go and they look at the red layer with X-ray energy dispersive spectroscopy and confirm that the red layer is thermite. The ingredients of thermite being iron oxide and aluminum powder, in addition to carbon, oxygen, silica. Fascinating. Organic material. Come back to that. They get real curious and zoom into the red layer 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope. What do they find? Nano-sized particles of iron oxide crystals and aluminum platelets, 1,000 times smaller than the diameter of a human hair. set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, carbon. That's what's responsible for the gas expansion in high energy explosives like TNT. So here we have a mixture of incendiaries, thermite, which works by means of heat, and organic material, which is used in TNT to produce force or explosiveness. Because the literature from the time at Los Alamos and Lawrence Livermore Lab was developed, they were developing super thermites, and they document that these samples ignite at above 758 degrees Fahrenheit. When they ignite, oh, this is interesting. So when they ignite, they produce the same results as the peer-reviewed literature. Producing what? Producing, can you zoom in on this? Not today. There we go. There we go. Producing iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the iron microspheres found in the World Trade Center dust by the U.S. Geological Survey. So you see, we know where these iron microspheres came from. They came from these red-gray chips. As if we didn't know, because they're found attached to these partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. So we have an internally consistent, self-corroborating set of repeatable experimental data, which can be used in a court of law to bring the real perpetrators to justice. Let's face it, this is extremely sophisticated material, made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories. Not made in a cave in Afghanistan. The peer-reviewed paper concludes that the red layer is active, unreacted thermitic material incorporating nanotechnology, highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. Needs to be followed up. Look at this in the Bentham Open Chemical Physics Journal. Search for active thermitic materials in the World Trade Center dust. So the additional 8 key, very uncharacteristic, by the way, features of controlled demolition because of the incendiary use here instead of explosives. They're direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire does not create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause less robust structures to collapse, but they do so asymmetrically, gradual deformations, following the path of least resistance. Especially these fires, which were diminished at the time of the collapse, indicated by the thick black smoke. They're oxygen-starved and cooler, and probably completely extinguished during the collapse. And even before the collapse, you can see that the FLIR cameras are documenting 200-degree, 300-degree temperatures max at the time of the collapse. Well, what do the experts say? At least those experts without financial or political obligations that, again, might sway their objective opinion. We have Ronald Brookman, one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth demanding a new investigation, says it doesn't look anything like a heat-induced gravitational collapse mechanism. Why did the complete collapse of the Twin Towers become inevitable? Why would all 110 stories drop straight down to the ground in 10 seconds, pulverizing the contents to dust and twisted steel? Ed Muniak, fire protection engineer, signed on to the petition also. Fires were very weak. NIST reports confirmed that the temperature was low, the fire temperature, and the steel temperatures, by the way. The WTC collapses have no resemblance to any previous high-rise fire collapse. But surely the evidence was preserved in what was easily the most profound structural failures in history. Let's see. Listen to structural engineer Abulhassan Astani Azal, Berkeley.
After 9/11, we realized that Port Authority of New York and New Jersey has sent all the steel that we need to study. That's why I'm here to study steel. Has sent all the steel to recycling plant to go to China for recycling. For what? For 15 cents a pound. Just nothing. And all the evidence of steel went to melting pot.
All the evidence of the steel went to the melting pot. Went to China for recycling, prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it wasn't. What were they trying to cover up? Easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures. We have 400 truckloads a day starting just 2 weeks after 9/11. Putting them on these barges. This is the illegal destruction of evidence in a crime scene. So what have we been able to show today? Which of the hypotheses is supported by the evidence? Destruction by jet planes, fires, explosions, controlled demolition. We leave this question in your hands and on your conscience, because if you, like us, have come to the conclusion that jet planes and fire did not bring this building down, then you have a load on your shoulders. You've got to do something, because today we found features 8, 9, and 10. Along with last week, features 1 through 7. These are direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. It is jet fuel, by the way. And with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony that we've been showing, this is proof of controlled demolition to 3,000 architects and engineers, and we're asking you to join them. In fact, we'll be coming to your questions here. Are there any questions today, Andy? Uh-oh, hold on a second, Andy. There you go. Start over, Andy. I didn't have you on the screen.
Sure, we do have questions today. Just want to let everyone know you can submit them in the questions and information form, and we'll do our best to answer them. Those are at ae911truth.org under continuing education. And I don't know, Richard, were you ready for questions now, or?
Yeah, we're at that point. You bet. So if you need some time, I'll go ahead and tell people how they can get involved if you want to load up the question.
Certainly. 1 second.
Let's see. We'll encourage you guys to subscribe on our website for the newsletter. You can find out the latest evidence that we're putting together and getting out to engineers, architects, the media, and so forth. And the latest, the progress that we're making toward getting a real investigation, which is growing substantially. But get informed. Get on our website and look through the evidence section. There's videos, photos, documents, incredible quantities of information in easy to digest simple steps. And sign the petition demanding a new investigation supporting the 3,000 architects and engineers. We have 20,000 others as well. You can be among them. And donate to the cause. We have to move forward with the efforts to now get the Halsey report out that we've been telling you about, the finite element analysis of Building 7 by the University of Alaska. We're now in a fundraising drive, and you can support us to get that out to all engineers really fast by going to our webpage and donating here. Also encourage you to become a member. Join the family of sustaining supporters at AE 9/11 Truth and help us to awaken the American public, which is asleep at the wheel, which is what allowed this all to happen. You can volunteer with us too. Andy, what are the ways people can volunteer?
Absolutely. We need people more now more than ever, especially if you are at home and not going to work during our current world situation. So if you got a few hours a week to donate, there's things we can have you do, and our outreach continues despite anything going on. So please volunteer. You can go to ae911truth.org, fill out the form, and within a few days we'll get back in touch with you and see how we can put you to work. Typically, how you want to volunteer is the way that you will fit in best. So we'll talk to you and get you in the right place.
Perfect. And there's things you can do at home too if you don't like working with people or us. It's happened before. Contact your elected reps, television, radio, newspapers on your own. Send them the ae911truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find and everybody else that you know. Screen our DVDs, which I'll show you an example of one, and send them the brochures. You can get 100 of them for $10 on our at our store on our website, and support the effort, as I mentioned, because one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country from the University of Alaska, the chairman of the Civil Engineering Department, Professor Leroy Halsey, has engaged in a $400,000 now. $300,000 4-year study in which he has conclusively determined that this building, the third skyscraper to collapse on 9/11, did also not come down by fire. So how did it come down? It didn't experience a progressive collapse, as NIST claimed. It was actually a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of all the columns, which is why we have, one of the main reasons, we have 5 New York area commissioners signed unanimously onto a resolution demanding a new investigation into the destruction of these 3 towers, and why we have legislation that's ready to go. Andy, tell us a little more about this. Andy, are you still on mute?
Oh dear. Okay, there we go. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
All right, we're getting some gremlins today on my end, but this is Bobby McIlvaine. He was in the North Tower the morning of the September 11th attacks. He was killed by an explosion as he was entering that building. And of course, by the nature of how he died, we have serious questions about how these towers actually came down. So we've named this legislation after him. It's called the Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act, and it is exactly what it says there. It's the path to justice for the almost 3,000 people who died on that terrible day. And it would do exactly what we've been asking Congress to do for a number of years, which is look into the evidence of explosive demolition at the World Trade Center towers and actually seriously look at it, consider it. It is legislation that can be passed in either house of Congress, or we create a select committee to do this. And of course, like anything else with Congress, like with any kind of issue that Congress doesn't want to deal with, they need to hear from their constituents and have that necessary pressure put on them to examine this and consider the legislation. So again, if you are home right now from work and you got a few minutes, you can go to ae911truth.org/justice. You can learn more about the act there. You can download a copy of it, read it for yourself, see what it's all about. There's a letter from Richard also and a letter from Bob McIlvaine. You can print that out and you can go to a town hall meeting. May not be possible at this moment in history, but in the future you can do that. You can go to you can actually write in your email, or write in your full address rather, and it will generate an email to your representatives in Congress. You can also call them on the phone. No one's stopping you from doing that. And one thing that happens when you do that is they still have to make a note of what you talked about. And if they get a lot of calls saying that you want the congressman to look into the Bobby McIlvaine Act and look into the evidence from AE 9/11 Truth, that gets passed on to them. And if your congressman's on the science committee or the oversight committee, all the better, because these are committees that really have a stake and have real oversight over NIST in the case of the science committee, and can really have a lot of power to do something with this. So please get involved. Nothing happens in this world unless we make it happen, and you are the people to do that.
That's right. And that's another reason, by the way, because of your support, that we were able to submit 60 points of evidence that you've been looking at in this 3-part series to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan, who's agreed to comply with the law requiring him to submit it to a special grand jury. And we have now sued him to prove that he's doing just that. And we're waiting for results to come this month or next month. So that's very exciting, because we've also sued the FBI to provide this evidence to Congress because they were required to do so because they had it in their possession and they didn't give it to them. So that would make it public, of course. And so what is the evidence? Well, you've seen some of it today. The rest of it is in this documentary, which combines 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence. And I want to give you a couple-minute taste of this exciting documentary.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yeah, and you can watch this for free on YouTube. Just search for it. That's the 1 hour version. The 1.5 hour version, which I highly recommend, which includes psychologists, try to help us to understand what happens when people get hit with this information. Why is it so hard to digest? It changes our worldview, they've found, for instance. Also, extended interviews with those experts that you saw there. Extraordinary. That's in our store. This one's free to download, beyondmisinformation.org. I just go to the website there, and it's a 50-page book on it, very easy to read by the layperson as well as engineers, and a 2-hour presentation that we have for you as well, free on YouTube. And also free on YouTube, 15-minute documentary on Building 7, narrated by actor Ed Asner, made for PBS. Very professionally done, highly recommended to introduce this subject to others whom you want to share with, but may not have, an hour to look at some of this material. Looks like we do have some questions, Andy.
Yes, we got plenty today. The first one asks, in questions and answers to NIST on Building 7, NIST said sulfur is present in the gypsum wallboard used for interior partitions. I researched wallboard that contains sulfur and discovered that some Chinese drywall contains sulfur. However, there are noticeable side effects. Chinese drywall contains levels of sulfur, which is responsible for a rotten egg smell, blackened or corroded pipes, failure of air conditioners and household appliances, and health problems such as asthma, coughing, headaches, sore throats, irritated eyes. I doubt that these problems exist in the World Trade Center because NIST would have focused on that to prove their point. Any comments?
Yeah, I'm unaware that Chinese gypsum wallboard contains sulfur. I'm presuming by the question that we have imported Chinese wallboard smelling like rotten eggs for use in office buildings in this country. I highly doubt it. We should do some research, and of course, this was 1960s and early 70s that this was put in. We weren't importing wallboard from China back then, but it's a very interesting proposition. Of course, calcium sulfate is what is in wallboard, and it is inert. It doesn't release. It doesn't turn into sulfur. It doesn't attack the steel, as you saw in that experiment that civil engineer John Cole was able to do in his own backyard in 2,000 degree or whatever fire temperatures he was able to achieve. So, Andy, you have any thoughts on that one?
I have no comments. Anytime anybody has any information and you don't think we have processed it, go ahead and send it to info@ae911truth.org. Or if this is our common watcher to this webinar, you have my email, go ahead and send it to me. So I'll see it. All right. And the next question says, in questions and answers to NIST, they allege that molten aluminum mixed with office materials can easily appear orange colored like a log in a fire, and it would not appear silvery like molten aluminum normally does. So why didn't Shyam Sunder give that answer to Alan Reese? In his answer, he said the color wasn't orange and said it was silvery.
Yeah, well, he was trying to give some answer. Shyam Sunder of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. He was on the spot. So he produced a combination of made up stuff and lies. As we've seen today, molten aluminum looks silvery. It doesn't glow bright yellow, like you see in this picture in the upper right here, glowing liquid molten metal. Silver doesn't do that. It's not in daylight conditions. It has a little glow to it at night. So they're just making stuff up to try to explain away the molten material. The other way it's explained away is with the large banks of batteries for computer sets of terminals melted, and this melted lead was pouring out. Same problem though. It's silvery. It doesn't glow bright yellow. So it doesn't get to those temperatures. So any thoughts on that one, Andy?
I think you pretty much covered it. I will say that Alan Reese really did a service to the truth movement with that interview right after the World Trade Center 7 official report came out, interviewing Shyam Sunder. And of course, Alan Reese is the producer over at No Lies Radio. And I actually took that interview a couple of years ago on my show, 9/11 Freefall. And I would play it for a little while and then stop it and add my own comments. So I did a whole hour on this. So I advise people to go into the Freefall archives, just type in Alan Reese, and it'll come up, and listen to that. And then a lot of my commentary is encapsulated into that show. But no, it was a great interview. Next question asks, do you know if the global pandemic will now prevent any grand juries from performing their duties? And Richard, if I may, I just want to interject here because I was curious about this myself. I said, it's a darn good question. I have an article here from NPR. Federal courts scramble to adapt to disruptions from coronavirus panic. It's from March 16th. And there's a paragraph that says, in the Southern District of New York, for example, all criminal trials scheduled to begin between Monday and April 27th have been postponed, according to an order from Chief Judge Colleen McMahon. Trials that have already started will continue, and grand juries will remain at work as well. So that's what I have to contribute to that question.
Well, that's good news. And of course, we are suing the U.S. Attorney and William Barr to prove to a judge that they have engaged in giving this evidence to a special grand jury. So we await those results.
Okay, now the next one is a comment from YouTube, and I've heard people make this point, so I'm just going to read the comment, and you can comment on it yourself, Richard. Jet fuel makes it sound exotic. It is kerosene, same thing as in your Coleman stove. How hot can you get that thing?
Well, Coleman stoves use white gas or propane, so it's not the same as your Coleman stove. But there are kerosene lanterns that use kerosene, which is what essentially jet fuel is. And as we showed today, ME Petroleum, one of the largest manufacturers of jet fuel, shows that it burns in open air only about 600 degrees Fahrenheit, which is substantially less than the hottest office fires. So it didn't contribute, certainly didn't contribute to the melting of jet fuel. Excuse me, the melting of steel. Jet fuel did not, it burned up in just 90 minutes, as we showed last week. Excuse me, 90% of it burned up in most of it outside the building, and the rest of it in about 10 minutes. So all that we had was normal office fires that then an hour to an hour and a half later, after the jet plane impacts, are said to have caused the collapse of these two buildings. So we studied that in some detail last week. I encourage people to take a look at that that show in YouTube. Just search Part 2, 9/11, An Architect's Guide.
Okay, our last question is really just a comment on Facebook, and this is brilliant because I've been making this point many times this week, and I actually end to this week's 9/11 Freefall podcast making this point as well. But this person said, perfect time, everyone is cowering in their homes with nothing to do but watch or read. And that is absolutely true. What a great time to do 9/11 activism right now while you are at home. And yes, it's going to be very difficult to go out into the streets and hand out brochures and do things like that, but you can accomplish a lot right from your own living room. I mean, before I joined the AE staff, I had a pretty good operation going out of my living room. It was like almost like the Batcave or something, where I did a lot of online activism. I mean, just very clever things that you can do is go into one of those sites where you chat with strangers. You can have a video of Building 7 coming down with a message about how this is impossible. You can write it yourself. Tell them to go to ae911truth.org, point the camera at it, and just have fun watching from the side, watching strangers react to it or come across it. Little things like that going on news websites. I remember there was a local news show that had your news, and I guarantee they were counting on people showing videos of squirrels, amusing little videos of squirrels or their grandkids on this. I would post stuff about 9/11 until they stopped me. So this is a great time to discover your inner creativity and fill the internet with as much truth about 9/11 as you can, because people are basically limited to TV and internet right now as it is in many cases. And if you're in there with family and friends who have put off watching experts speak out, what a great time for them to sit down and watch it. So that's my 2 cents on it. Richard?
Yeah, that's great. I encourage people to do everything they can, because listen, 9/11 is more important than the loss of buildings. We have 3,000 people that were murdered in those buildings. And we have 2 million people that were murdered in the wars as a result of the collapse of these buildings. We have the loss of civil liberties through the Patriot Act, the Military Commission Act, the Defense Authorization Act of 2012. This is a huge deal. We've had wars, a global war on terror, $6.5 trillion that's been spent, all because of 9/11. If 9/11 is proven, as we have in this 3-week series, to have been staged, because these are controlled demolitions, and let's face it, Al-Qaeda didn't have access to the 3 of the most highly secure buildings outside the Pentagon. We're talking about some sort of an inside operation that involved elements inside and outside of the government, rogue elements, and that were very well placed, obviously, and placed in the media, because the media covered it up, didn't cover any of the evidence that the 9/11 Truth Movement has been covering for 18 years. By the way, the media is comprised of 5 corporations only, owning all of it, 90% of it. Who owns those corporations? Who runs them? Well, the same groups of individuals that are responsible for running corporations in the arms industry, the oil industry, the banking industry, the insurance industry. These are not working for the benefit of the American people or the citizens of the world. So that's why we're at this 18 years later still. Not to get it just an investigation of buildings, right? We're trying to wake up the whole public and create a groundswell of public outcry for a new investigation, which will expose the real perpetrators as far and as deep as they go. And we can't stop because of the coronavirus, even though it's stopped a huge percentage of our economy already. We have to keep going. And that's what we're doing. So join us. Today we were looking at part 3 here, Twin Towers in extreme heat. We covered high-rise fires, pyroclastic-like clouds, molten steel and iron microspheres, thermite, nanothermite, evidence that this was an inside operation. As we did last week in part 2, the explosiveness of the Twin Towers, sudden near free-fall collapses, high-velocity lateral ejections, shattering the steel frame, mid-air pulverization of the concrete. We found that 100,000 tons of steel was expelled 600 feet outside the perimeter of these buildings. Therefore, it's not available to crush the building. We found that 90,000 tons of concrete was pulverized to a fine powder and expelled in a 3 square mile area in a blanket 4 inches thick. Therefore, it wasn't available to crush the building. Therefore, 2/3 of the weight of the building is gone. It can't crush the building. Then you have all this evidence of incendiaries and explosives on top of that. With part one, which we'll come back to in April, encourage you to join us the first week of April, Thursday. We'll be looking at World Trade Center 7, the third skyscraper to collapse on 9/11. 47 stories, symmetrically, free fall into its own footprint. Clearly a controlled demolition. We'll be looking at that evidence in April. I hope you come back and join us. Whoops, forget Larry Silverstein today. We'll come back to him next week. And I encourage you to join us. And until then, take care, stay safe out there and healthy. Bye for now.